This is an ABC podcast.
Hi, I'm Amanda Vanstone. You're on RN. Welcome to Counterpoint. Thanks for joining in. Would you believe that the capacity to thrash things out through disagreement is what got us to the moon? Well, the Wright brothers weren't qualified engineers. They didn't have degrees. In fact, they ran a bicycle store. But they started manned flight. And speaking of the moon, remember the pictures taken from that manned space flight? A beautiful round Earth. How can people today still believe the Earth is flat? Seriously. Those photos were fabulous, but that's the universe, endlessly fascinating. Of course, if you live in a city, you don't get to look up and see a dark sky with all those wonderfully bright stars. Some people do. But first, to civil society. Those organisations and clubs that aren't government. They're a big part of our community, but maybe they're not where we need them.
Oh, he stands in front of me and he's staring manically, screaming, "Oh, society, what have you done to me?"
Civil society. It's important. It means it's not government, it's not politicians, it's you and I getting together in different ways. It might be local community groups, they might be sporting groups, they might be looking after parks, whatever. It's us getting together, doing things, helping each other. But as it turns out, civil society isn't evenly spread. It's not like butter on your toast. No, there are blobs somewhere and less in other places. And surprise, surprise, maybe where there's less, there needs to be more. To talk about this, we're going to be joined by Howard Husick. He's a senior fellow in domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and he joins us now from New York. Howard Husick, welcome to Counterpoint.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for having me.
Civil society is a good thing, isn't it?
Well, it's a very good thing because whether it accomplishes this goal or that goal, the sheer fact of people cooperating together creates trust amongst ourselves that creates the social fabric that we all rely on. You know, as we watch what's happening in Afghanistan, and I'm fixated right now on that as an American, we know that once that government changes, and it's already changed, there'll be no civil society there, just like there's no civil society in China. Independent groups formed of our own volition, doing what we think is best, all that is right out in these totalitarian governments. So in a society of liberty like the United States and Australia are fortunate to have in the history of the world, civil society, we luxuriate in that.
Yeah, we do. But some people, I find, well, I don't think it's too harsh to say they ignore it. They take it for granted. It's just in their mind, because things are going fairly well for them, or a bunch of do-gooders getting together to, I don't know, protect native birds or plant trees or whatever. But I think they would miss them if they'd gone. Even if you don't personally use the benefits that one creates, you'd notice the difference if they left. Is that right? It's sort of almost not invisible, but it's there in a silent way, and you'll know when it's gone.
Well, I think it's quite unusual in the world. Truly, I think it is the Anglo-Saxon civil society culture that you're talking about, and we share it in America and Australia, but it's not that common. The idea that you would come together to protect birds or protect parks. So we shouldn't take it for granted. And one of the things that I worry about is that as the social welfare state has expanded, one of the reasons we used to work together to protect ourselves was that the government didn't protect us with social insurance schemes and whatnot. And so communities at all income levels found vehicles for protecting themselves. And as the social insurance state has expanded, and, you know, maybe that's a good thing, maybe it has its drawbacks, but it decreases the urgency of working together. And my own personal fear is that we're now seeing the civil society organizations, the sporting clubs, the bird watchers, become a kind of a luxury good that the upper classes, the upper middle classes enjoy for themselves, and lower income communities who may not have the time to avail themselves of getting together to do these things may not enjoy.
Is that a sign of, well, partly that in lower income areas, people may not have the extra time, if you're holding down 2 jobs or working nights or whatever, the opportunity for you to participate in bird watching, park protection, whatever, the local council, for example, the opportunities are less in terms of your own time. But does that also mean that people in the wealthier areas are investing in their own communities, not in the broader community?
Well, I think that's a terrific point, Amanda, and it worries me a great deal. I think that historically, people of means felt a responsibility to involve themselves in communities of people of lesser means, to provide assistance or advice. There was a very successful movement in this country. I don't know if there was a counterpart in Australia called the Settlement House movement in the early 1900s, where people of means actually went to live in poorer communities to help assimilate the many millions of immigrants that came to the United States at that time. I fear that people of means have lost that sense of shared community. And so if people of means improve their own schools and their own districts, well, that's all well and good. But there's no reason they couldn't even provide financial assistance to whatever community groups are trying to do the best thing in lower income communities. We shouldn't be so polarized in that way, I fear.
Now, you mentioned Robert Putnam and his book Bowling Alone, but more particularly an early book he wrote about making democracy work, focused on Italy. What was the story there?
It's really fascinating. Putnam, who is, one of the most accomplished social scientists in the world at Harvard, his breakthrough book, Making Democracy Work, observed that there was this fundamental difference between northern and southern Italy. And that in northern Italy there were more, he actually specified choral societies. But that was just a stand-in for civil society more broadly and for so-called intermediary groups somewhere between the government and the family that created a means for people to work together on something that fostered social trust broadly, that fostered even private enterprise to be able to work on the basis of, yes, your word is your bond. And in southern Italy, Sicily, famously, that was not the case. And as a result, it was a lesser developed society.
You can't overlook any group that brings people together, largely from different suburbs is a good idea, but I think you and I agree different wealth groups would be good too, is a good thing. It's a binder that binds us together.
Right. And it's no coincidence that in China, civil society is basically prohibited. The idea of there being independent groups, famously the Falun Gong, who have their own spiritual mantras, they're persecuted, right? And they're not aggressively saying we should overthrow the government. Their sheer independence and self-organization is viewed as a threat to the Chinese Communist Party.
You're on RN. This is Counterpoint. I'm Amanda Vanstone. I'm talking with Howard Husick, Senior Fellow in Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's in New York, and we're talking about civil society. You've got to get out there and be a part of it. Now, in the work that you did, you mentioned a couple of examples, and we don't need to know the names of the towns or the numbers, but it's pretty clear from your work that there are more non-profit organisations in areas where more people have degrees, where there's higher incomes. In other words, the better off are even better off because they have these, not-for-profits, I suppose you could call them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, I dove into census data and Postal Service data and immersed myself in that. There are some exceptions. It's a departure from the past. That's the thing about it. It used to be quite ubiquitous in the United States. When you go back to famously Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1840s in Democracy in America, he said it was not confined, it was universal. That when there was a problem, Americans got together and started an association. And there are still some kind of old-fashioned communities. I mentioned one in rural Indiana, small-town Indiana. They have fishing game clubs and things like that. But that's dying out. It's dying out. And we have these too many lower-income communities where there are very few organizations that are dedicated to the general good of the community. And that's a terrible shame. And the social trust that it creates allows people to say, well, if I see a criminal, I'm going to tell the police because I basically accept the idea that this is my community and it's a shared community. And we're seeing the breakdown of the social fabric in lower-income communities in America that is a very worrisome trend.
Now, is a part of this, us as humans collectively and individually, feeling less capable ourselves, saying, oh, there's nothing I can do about it? Or is it more an acceptance that, or incorrect belief in my view, rather than acceptance, incorrect belief that they can fix it, the government should do something, the council should do something, they should do something, not I should do something. I should get some friends together and we should do something about this. Are we giving up our authority, if you like, to be full citizens?
Yeah, I agree with the premise of your question, Amanda. I'm not a libertarian. I'm not going to push back full bore against the social welfare, the social insurance state. But we also have what I call a social service state, which all sorts of ills are to be ameliorated by the government. And so that creates a different consciousness amongst us, a consciousness that we need a new program rather than we need a new effort on our own part. And so I think that we've adjusted our expectations about how to ameliorate problems, and not just to ameliorate problems, to celebrate shared interests. You mentioned garden clubs. Those sorts of things are it, you know. I mean, my family and I once spent some time on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. And, you know, I always read the local newspaper wherever I am, and somebody had put in a notice, if you're interested in hiking together in this park at this time, join me. And so we did. That was civil society. And we were very impressed.
Yes, that's a good point. Civil society operating really well doesn't mean you have to join some formal group and go to annual general meetings and argue over who's going to be the president, the secretary or the chairman. It doesn't mean all of that. I mean, it can mean it, but it can be just recognising and acting and behaving as though you recognise that you're part of a society and other people might want to join in or need a hand or whatever. You've got an example about some young kids getting together building the little libraries. I'm not sure whether you mean the sort of thing I think, which is like a mini doll's house on a stick, on a pole, and you put them somewhere.
It is like a mini doll's house on a stick, yeah.
Okay, and you go and put books, and people now putting other things in there that people can have. You can go and just take what you want, what you need.
Yeah, yes. In my article, I do try to find some counterexamples because I always try to be constructive and to find something to cheer on. And the little libraries movement in the United States is people getting together and putting these small shelves out in public areas where people are welcome to take books and leave books. And the example that I loved was a young woman who was a public health faculty member at Long Island University. I'll give her a shout out, Heather Butts. She's on the faculty there at Long Island University, and she came up with the idea, I want to do this in low-income neighborhoods in New York City, in public housing, what you call social housing, right?
Yep.
And I'm going to have young adult teenagers work to build these with the local police, and she's really doing that. And so, wow, it just hit me like, this is the best example I found of how civil society can combat the anomia and even the dangerousness of some of these neighborhoods. And during the worst of the COVID times, people, even in public housing projects, social housing projects in New York, started leaving canned goods for people to pick up. And so they became flashpoints for civil society. So that's a way of saying Small things can matter a great deal, and we can do those small things. And we shouldn't shrink from them, and we shouldn't devalue them.
I know it's corny, but people say it and it's true. One person can make a difference. You can make a big difference in one person's life or a little difference in a lot of people's lives. And Howard Husick, you've hit it right on the button. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I thank you so much for having me, and I thank you for your interest.
Civil societies are important, and in them, you can have civil disagreements. How long since you've had a really good discussion with someone? Not an argument, but a difference of opinion, and you've really thrashed it out. Oh, that's so good for us to do that. It really is a good scrap. It's true, disagreements can be unpleasant, sometimes offensive, sadly. Disagreements are what find new truths and take us further ahead. They're extraordinarily valuable. To discuss this, we're going to talk to Ian Leslie. He's a writer in the UK. He writes for The New Statesman, The Economist, The Guardian, The Financial Times, and he's recently had a book published, Conflicted: How Productive Disagreements Lead to Better Outcomes. And he joins us now from London. Ian Leslie, welcome to Counterpoint.
Hello, Amanda. Very good to be here.
Well, Ian, this is a great piece that you've written for Ian magazine, but more importantly, wisely you've chosen the Wright brothers to demonstrate this point. Perhaps you can tell us why you chose them.
Oh, yeah. So the Wright brothers, as your listeners will know, invented the first aeroplane, effectively manned flight. So I knew that. Until I looked into their story, I hadn't quite realised how astonishing that achievement was. So this is around the turn of the 20th century, and there were people all over the world working on this same problem, and many of them were highly qualified scientists and engineers attached to great institutions, universities or corporations with lots of research funding. And the people who cracked it were two guys who ran a bike shop in a small town
It's a
in
fabulous
Ohio.
Story. It's
absolutely
it's
crazy
lovely.
when you think about it. And when you read about why these guys got there before anyone else, a big part of it was the way that they interacted with each other, right? They were a brilliant little team, and a big part of how they interacted was arguing, or what they called having a good scrap. They would absolutely tear each other's arguments and ideas apart every day, right? So if you walked past the shop, you would hear these arguments kind of floating out into the street. And anybody who didn't know them would think, oh my goodness, it sounds like they're having the most awful row. But then if you did know them, you know, oh no, this is just the way that Wilbur and Orville talk to each other. And actually, they loved each other very much, and they stayed close throughout their whole lives. They just enjoyed debating things like this, and they felt that it helped them do their thinking much, much quicker and much better.
I'm sure it did. Now, tell us about the father, Milton, because really, he was responsible for that, wasn't he?
He certainly played a big part in it, because from a very early age, he kind of trained them in argument. He trained them to think of argument as a way of, you know, making your thinking better. He would sit them down at the dinner table and he would give them a topic, and he'd instruct one of the boys to take one side of it and the other to take the other side. And then after 20 minutes, he'd say, right, now you swap sides and you make the other argument. And so they just were trained and got used to this idea that actually the way we get to truths and insights and new ideas fast is by arguing it through. And it's not a personal thing. So when I'm arguing with you, it's not an attack on you. It's just what we do. It's how we think and it's how we talk. And that proved to be enormously valuable to them and, of course, to us.
Well, the oldest one, you say, said, among other things, honest argument is merely a process of mutually picking the beams and motes out of each other's eyes so both can see clearly. And, you know, I've certainly in my life had plenty of experiences of really good argument, or you could call it discussion, where it is civil, it's not personal. It's really trying to work out what is the best way to go. But sadly, in the political realm and in the personal realm these days, it's very much driven by ego. And as you rightly point out in your article, humans don't like to admit error. And that stands in the way of this rational argument, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And if you go into an argument thinking, I'm 100% right and I've got to show that I'm 100% right, then the argument is going to be pretty futile. Because once you're in the stance where you think, well, I've got nothing to learn here, and I'm just going to effectively try and crush my opponent, then it just becomes a kind of dominance struggle, a tug of war, instead of a conversation in which you're both going to learn something and change your position a little bit, or at least learn about why the other person thinks what they think. And so a lot of what I talk about in my book on the topic is, don't think of argument as a zero-sum game in which you lose or win. Try and think of it as a conversation in which the group, the two of you or the four of you, whatever it is, will all come out a little bit more informed or a little bit more enlightened.
It's the confirmation bias, I think is what they call it, where we like to, confirm our own views. I certainly love it when mine are confirmed. I think we all do. Equally, I must say I'm lucky enough to find pleasure in being able to see something new. For me, it's a bit like, those silly cartoons they have where you can see two candlesticks or two faces, and the pleasure as a kid you get when you can see both. For me, argument's a bit like that. When you can see both, then I think you can begin to really, really understand. But confirmation bias is a hard thing to get over. And sadly, as you point out, it's often the clever and knowledgeable people who are more prone to that and use their skills to try and, as you say, win the argument. But
oh, yeah.
I don't understand why, if, as you say, the ability to reason is our supreme attribute, as you rightly point out, with this flaw of confirmation bias, if you bought it at a shop, you rightly say we'd send it back. Now, how did that happen, that we've got this fabulous capacity for reasoning, but confirmation bias messes it up?
Yeah. So it actually makes sense once you think about our reasoning or our thinking having evolved to work in a group and not just by ourselves, right?
Yes.
And this is really interesting. So when we think about thinking, we often think about somebody sort of lost in thought, right? So like Rodin's statue of the thinker, it's usually a man, hand to the brow, kind of lost in introspection. But actually, we evolved to think in groups. And when you think about it in that context, a little bit of confirmation bias is actually helpful because it pushes you to make the best argument you can for your argument.
Yes,
now,
I see that.
In a group, when everyone's doing that, everyone's motivated to make their best argument, you effectively get this kind of Darwinian process of many different arguments, of lots of variation in arguments. And at the same time as you're making your best ones, you're trying to knock the other ones down. And so when it's working well, we can talk about the right conditions for this, a group kind of process like that means that the strongest arguments survive. The weak ones get knocked down very quickly and only the strong ones survive. And that's effectively what the Wright brothers were doing. They were kind of throwing arguments at each other and using their confirmation bias to say, no, listen to me. This is how this plane is going to work. And then they would see if the other one could knock it out. And if they couldn't, then they would think, well, okay, maybe this is actually a really good theory.
I see what you're saying.
Reproduce that at scale.
That confirmation bias can be seen as, if you like, the incentive or accelerant for you to put your best argument. Yeah. And I think we can also say on the other side of it, it's a dampener on you accepting weak arguments because it makes you instinctively sceptical. So that in itself might be a good thing.
Yeah.
You're on RN. This is Counterpoint. I'm Amanda Vanstone. I'm talking with Ian Leslie. He's written a book, Conflicted, How Productive Disagreements Lead to Better Outcomes. Oh, that everyone understood that, but they don't. Now, Ian, you had a good story about Warren Buffett. I think that's a great story. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, so when a company is considering whether or not to acquire another company, they hire investment bankers to advise on whether or not they should do it. And if the deal goes ahead, then the investment banker takes a fee, right? So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest here. So what Buffett does is he hires somebody to make the opposite case. And if the deal doesn't go through, that person gets a fee, right? So he basically is harnessing confirmation bias at either end, right? He's not imagining there is some sort of perfectly neutral way to advise. He's saying, okay, well, let's give everyone the right opposing incentives. And then we get that process that we talked about, where we get the strongest arguments thrown up on both sides, and then the strongest argument will survive.
Well, I think this is a very positive thing we need to do, is to move to this. Now, there are a few conditions that we need to follow, aren't there? I mean, one is to openly disagree. What are the others?
Yeah, first of all, we need to have our disagreements out, right? Because if you don't have your disagreements, they don't go away, They just become submerged into passive aggression, right? And passive aggression is the most corrosive thing, and is really what eats into relationships. And so it's interesting to me that one of the reasons that people avoid disagreement and argument is they think it's going to harm their relationship in some way, but actually it's much more harmful not to have it in the long run, because it's the passive aggression which eats away. And actually I saw this in studies of couples, of marriages, where scientists have kind of studied couples who have different argument styles. Like some of them are very avoidant, some of them are very keen to get into arguments, and then tracked their progress over the year, 2 years, 5 years subsequently. And much to their surprise, actually, this wasn't a finding they were expecting. They have found that the couples who are really eager to get into arguments are the ones that, on average, end up being happier and more fulfilled, and the ones who solve their problems fastest. Because the ones who are not having the arguments are not learning about what each other thinks, right? Yeah. So one psychologist said to me, conflict is information. You get into an argument, even a little bit of a heated one, then you're really suddenly learning about what that person really thinks and really cares about beneath the kind of veil of politeness or decorum.
Well,
I think that applies to many situations.
Yeah, when you say really cares about, one way to, if you like, back up what you're saying here is if you think about someone you don't know and they walk past you in the street and they've got a placard up with which you disagree, you might not bother arguing with them. And someone you know but don't care for much, you might not bother. And the thing is, the people that you actually want to convince, your inner self says, I want to know what you think and I want you to know that I think this, are the people you care about. So you're quite right. Yeah. It's bad to let those things fester. Now, what's the second condition we need?
The second condition is, well, it's what you were talking about just then, really. You need to have some sort of relationship that goes beyond the disagreement itself, right? So you need to have some sense that this person is somebody that either I want to continue my relationship with because I'm married to them, or I work with them, or they're my friend, or just because they're another human being and I want to show that I respect them, right? If you don't have any of that, then the argument just becomes about the disagreement, and weirdly, it actually becomes more personal, right? So the less relationship you have, the more you think, oh, this person's disagreeing with me, therefore they must be terrible, evil, bad person, and I'm going to be really horrible to them. And you see this unfolding all the time on social media, where, people often have very little or no relationship with the person they're arguing with, and the argument gets very nasty very quickly.
Now, there's another one. There's a third condition. What's that?
You have to have some goal in common with the person or the people that you are arguing with, right? So this goes back to what I was saying earlier. If it's just about you and each person trying to win your little battle here, well, that's fine, but there is no way that conversation is going to be productive, right? In order for an argument or a debate to generate some sort of insight, some sort of light as well as heat, then you all have to have some sense that we're trying to achieve something bigger. So the Wright brothers knew that they wanted to invent an airplane, right? They had a very kind of clear objective. If you are in a marriage, your goal ultimately is to resolve the problem that you're arguing about and continue kind of, being happy in your marriage. If you're at work, You can have a really big debate about a decision that you're about to take, but it's because you all agree that you want the company to succeed, so ultimately. So you have to have that little bit of you, even when you're exercising your confirmation bias, and maybe you're getting quite passionate and quite heated and trying to put your point of view across. There has to be some bit of you which understands instinctively that we're doing this for some larger goal that we all agree on.
Indeed. Ian, Leslie, that you could get into the mind of every parliamentarian in the world and every young person on Twitter. We'd have a better world. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I enjoyed it.
We can have civil disagreements, but where do you start with someone who today thinks the world is flat? Sceptical people, I think, are good people. They're interesting because they challenge you to defend your position. Of course, the person who's sceptical about everything is a pain in the neck, but I mean people with a healthy dose of scepticism. Nonetheless, what about those people who think the world is flat? Still, today I was having a flip through Twitter. I came across a Universal Curiosity post, Voyage of the Moons. And it's been created using still images taken by the Cassini spacecraft during its flyby of Jupiter and while at Saturn. Well, I tell you what, it's spectacular. It really is. How could people believe the Earth is flat? Well, we'll find a bit more about that by talking to Adam Wakeling. He's an Australian writer, lawyer and historian, and he joins us now from Melbourne. Adam Wakeling, welcome back to Counterpoint.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks for having me back on the program.
Adam, I was a bit shocked to read that there are people today who think the Earth is flat. Tell us a bit more about that.
It is very surprising in many ways. In some ways, unsurprising, given how easily pseudoscience and conspiracy theories can flourish on the internet. 50 years ago, if you thought the world was flat, you would be the local eccentric. But today, if you think the world is flat, you can go online and you can find a community of people who agree with you. A small community, but enough people that some people have been able to be convinced that they are right and everyone else is wrong. There has been, though, a flat Earth community that's been kicking around since about the 1860s. It seems to have started as a reaction to scientific breakthroughs of the early 19th century, and it has surprisingly persisted. Usually under a charismatic leader, one charismatic leader dies, another one arises, and with the internet it has found a new life.
You mention a fellow called Samuel Burley Rowbotham, and you describe him as an eccentric English inventor, alternative medicine enthusiast, and publicity seeker. Now, that's a character type that's around today. A bit eccentric,
Yes.
alternative medicine believer, enthusiast and publicity seeker.
Yes, I have my suspicions about whether Rowbotham actually thought the world was flat or not, or whether he was purely a publicity seeker. He got quite a bit of publicity out of this and about some other adventures as well. In the early 1830s, he was the secretary of a Owenist commune. The Owenists were like the hippies of the early 19th century. They took to living in communes in the English countryside. And he lived near the Lincolnshire Fens, and he began to perform experiments on a canal called the Bedford Level. The Bedford Level is a log and straight canal. And these experiments, he convinced himself that the world was flat. And in 1865, he brought out a book called Zetetic Astronomy, Earth Not a Globe, where he made the argument that the Earth was flat rather than a globe. And the interesting thing about Rowbotham is he was one of the first people to try and pass himself off as a scientist. And he also drew on the Bible. So in some ways, he's the predecessor to the modern young earth creationist movement, and that he claimed that scientific experiments and interpretation of the scripture prove that the earth was flat rather than round.
Oh dear. Well, look, let's move a bit further forward in history. And there was another fellow, Charles Kenneth Johnson. He did a bit to rev it all up, but then he died and things went dormant for about 15 years or so, 14, 15 years. And then it came back again, and it came back, I think you say, because of the internet. And this is what I'm really interested in, apart from the issue of sceptics generally, is does the internet present the opportunity, as you were pointing out before, for groups of like-minded people to get together and therefore get strength from each other, like a bully in school gets a bit of strength because he's got 4 or 5 mates, or she, that push others around. Someone can get on the internet and find other people with the same odd sort of views, and they give each other strength and build on it, and then they get more and more. Is the internet partly to blame for this?
Oh, absolutely. The internet, as with any of the other major advances that we've had, there's costs and benefits to the internet. The internet makes it very cheap to communicate. It means that people can connect with like-minded people around the world. It means our social circle is no longer limited to the people next door, our co-workers, or people we meet in church or at the supermarket. And it makes it very easy to bypass censorship and find non-official sources of information, all of which have been great things. On the other hand, as I said before, it does allow people who hold extreme views to find a community. And there's an interesting social phenomenon where when a group of people get together who hold a minority position, they can become collectively more extreme than anyone was at the start. And then there's the fact that they obviously give each other support. And as with a lot of online fringe movements, you see this in flat earthers, and you see this particularly in the testimony of people who've left the flat earth movement, where they talk about how the movement gave them a community, they had friends, there was an us and them phenomenon where they and the other flat earthers were the real truth seekers and they were persecuted, and the people in authority were evil and were telling lies and were misleading people. And that gave, I think, for a lot of them a real sense of purpose.
You're on RN. This is Counterpoint. I'm Amanda Vanstone. I'm talking with Adam Wakeling. He's an Australian writer, lawyer and historian. And we're talking about, can you believe it? People who believe the earth is flat. Yes, today, in 2021, there are people who believe the earth is flat. Adam, you talk about people who've changed their mind, and they mention what they got from being a flat earther, a sense of community with others, that gave them strength, etc. But it is possible to get through to some of these people, isn't it?
It is, and this is probably the most interesting question out of the whole thing, is how to de-radicalise people. Like, the flat earth movement is interesting, but there are pseudoscientific and conspiracy movements around today which are extremely damaging. Obviously, many of the conspiracies around COVID-19 and vaccination, for example, put people's lives at risk. So this question of how you persuade people out of holding pseudoscientific beliefs, in some ways it is discouraging because it's very easy to prove that the earth is not flat. I mean, if you walk outside, you'll see a horizon. There would not be a horizon if the earth was flat. I mean, if you go into a tall building, you can see further than you can at ground level. That would not be possible if the earth was flat. Even outside of the photos of the earth that we have from space, things like the way the stars change as you move from north to south, Aristotle knew that the earth was a globe for all of these reasons, and anyone can use their eyes and see the same proof that Aristotle did 2,500 years ago. So in some ways it is discouraging that people can be persuaded to think the earth is flat when it's so easy to disprove. I mean, how then do you, for example, prove that vaccination is safe and effective if you can't convince this minority of 2% of the population that the earth is round?
When you're talking about these people who were flat earthers, I mean, you described one fellow who admitted that he had an addictive personality. Well, that's not the end of the world. Lots of people have got that. And he had watched a couple of flat earth videos. And this is spectacular. I don't know whether you were trying to be amusing when you wrote this article. You say he'd gone down to the beach, found that the horizon looked further away than he thought it should be, and became hooked. I mean, is that all it takes?
Yeah, this particular man is an interesting case study because there is a type of personality that will get drawn into this sort of thing. And it comes back also to the question of skepticism, which is where no one is a perfect skeptic. We all have unbalanced skepticism. We are all more likely to believe bad things about people we dislike. We find it harder to believe bad things about people we like. We readily accept new information if it supports our worldview. We are naturally suspicious if we hear something that challenges our worldview. Flat earthers are people who take that problem to an extreme, where they can be very easily persuaded by sort of crankish information, but then have unlimited skepticism towards official sources of information. But the really interesting point about this and about this de-radicalisation question in general, Amanda, is this one about mindset. So these two people who bought out of the movement were persuaded by the evidence, but they both said they had to be in the right mindset to be persuaded. And I think for both of them, they had drifted away from the movement a bit. They'd lost interest. They'd gone about their lives and done some other things. And then at some point, they saw that piece of evidence that proved to them that the world was round, and they accepted it. But they both said they had to be in that mindset to be persuaded, in the same way they had to be in a particular mindset at the start to fall into the conspiracy in the first place. The lesson that we can all take out of the Flat Earth movement is to be proportionally sceptical is probably the best way of putting it. I mean, not many people go so far as to become a flat earther, but it's very easy for us to, as I said before, dismiss things that we don't like, to credulously accept information we hear if we like it, if it supports our worldview. So I think the lesson for all of us is be mindful of our own biases, consider the source when we read information, and I think the best way that anyone listening to this program can not get sucked into pseudoscience or the false information that bounces around the internet these days is if you read something online, if you read it even in a mainstream news story, if you read it on Facebook and it claims it's a scientific claim, go and dig through it until you find the original source and see if it is a credible source. And if you can't find a source, be suspicious of it. And if you can find a credible source, make a peer-reviewed journal, and it's more likely to be accurate.
Adam Wakeling, I've loved reading this article because it was such a surprise to think that in 2021 people would think the Earth is flat. Thanks very much for joining us again.
Thanks, Amanda. My pleasure.
Well, the soapbox, here's my rant this week. My husband loves Monty Python. He loves that song, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. It's ridiculous. You can't be blindly, crazily positive, but you can find the good. There's always some there. And it's important to find it for yourself. You know, I have a young niece who was really crook, like in intensive care, in the early days of COVID. And before she went to intensive care, everyone's masked up. Everyone's terrified with early days of COVID. So there are no nurses with smiles. They've all got moon masks on and, no touchy-feely, not much conversation. It was a really frightening experience and probably intensive care even more so. But you know what? Thanks to the help of the medical profession, she survived. But she now knows that she can go through that kind of thing, come out the other end. So she knows how strong she is. And for a young girl, that's a marvellous thing to know. We can all find the positives somewhere. Someone told me you should list off 4 or 5 things every morning that you think is positive and then chuck it in the bin, have a new one the next day. She was laughing because her husband wasn't on the first 2 days, and then she thought he might see it. But you might start with the basics. Well, I'm alive. There's a sun in the sky. I live in Australia and I've got friends. Doesn't seem like much. But I tell you what, it's a good, positive attitude, a way to start the day. What are some simple things I'm happy about that other people would take for granted? Start your day that way and you will feel better. Something that'll make you happy whenever you think about it is a memory of having seen a dark sky with bright stars. When you were a kid, were you afraid of the dark? If you were, it was probably the notion of some bogeyman. Kids are often afraid of the dark. But what about as an adult? How often do you go out and just look up into the dark night sky? Or have you stopped doing that because you live in a city and the reflective light, I suppose it is, stops you being able to see the magnificent stars that are there? I know when someone goes to Parachilna in the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, I always say, don't forget to go out at night. And often they say, that's where we're going, to look at the stars. And when you get to see them outside of a city, in a more remote place, they are fantastic. So we need dark skies, and people are working on this. Joining us now to discuss the importance of dark sky preserves, and we have dark sky places in Australia, is Geetika Jain. She writes for Condé Nast Traveller, and she joins us now from London. Geetika Jain, welcome to Counterpoint.
Hello, Amanda, and thank you for having me.
Gee, if you're in London, you wouldn't go out and see too much, would you? You'd have to go a fair way out.
That is correct. Even though I have to admit, I've found out the secret of enjoying dark skies in London is to walk to Hyde Park at night. And, I've walked every single day in Hyde Park. And only recently it struck me when a friend took me there at midnight. And we stood there on a perfectly beautiful new moon and watched the water reflected in the Serpentine, and the swans came up to us, and it was a magical moment steps away from home.
And I must say, I would have thought that the glow from London would have still impacted on that. But nonetheless, getting somewhere where there isn't that light interfering with your vision is a good thing. Now, why do you think we should embrace the dark?
You're absolutely right, Amanda. The dark is now a precious commodity because our skies are overlit with sky glow, and we actually cannot see what our ancestors saw clearly and, happily for centuries on end. The reason why we need dark is for many reasons. First of all, there is the knowledge base that our astronomers need. They are studying the skies, and they found they had to go all the way to Atacama Desert or to places where there was no moisture and the instruments could work well. And they felt, why can't we study these in our own homes? And that's how, in 1988, two astronomers decided to set up the Dark Sky Association. So for the first reason, it's the knowledge base. And then the wildlife. We have turtles, hatchlings that navigate by celestial lights. They know to walk towards the water. That's how their lives start. But with artificial lights, they often go the wrong way to their own detriment, and they get killed under the crunch of tires and whatnot. Fireflies communicate with each other with their glow. And if you have pinpricks of light everywhere, it's terribly confusing for them.
Yeah.
There are migratory birds as well. There's a lot of serious reasons for us as humans, such as melatonin. We absolutely need the dark. Our circadian rhythms are now breaking because of the overlighting, which only came as recently as 100 years ago. But already, we're on our tablets and our phones, and because of the electricity that's around us, we're sleeping later. And I think one of the very, very serious reasons for not overlighting our skies and our homes and our spaces is the pollution that we are creating. We don't make the connection that a 100-watt light bulb, if left on for a year, consumes as much as half a ton of coal. Electricity
That's fantastic, isn't it? I mean, that's a really clear example of the problems. And, there are many businesses developing now to help people manage their sleep problems, and possibly doing what I'm trying to do, although I do occasionally get stuck on a streaming device with some television that I like to watch. But I try and turn everything off, pull the curtains, and have darkness. And I do find that makes a big difference. You can sleep much better in the dark than you can otherwise. Anyway, the point is, you and I both think we need to repossess the dark. We're going to reclaim the dark.
Absolutely. I also find that I'm connecting with my wild side. There's a part of adventure that I'm starting to enjoy enormously in my travels. Just, when the day ends and people are so focused on dinners and partying. And then just like our ancestors did, they sat by a fireside, and when that glow of the fireside finished, they looked up. And I'm beginning to now walk out at night. Places like Ladakh. I was recently with the snow leopards up in the high Himalayas of India, in a little village, a 9-home village. And it was just such a delight not to see wires, electrical wires anywhere, pylons anywhere. And at night, it was the celestial orbs came to bloom, and it's just magical. And people don't realize they're missing out on something very special that, we own it. The night sky belongs to us, and we really ought to enjoy it.
You're on RN. This is Counterpoint. I'm Amanda Vanstone, and I'm talking with Geetika Jain. She's a travel writer with Condé Nast Traveller. And we're talking about dark skies, the need for them, and how fabulous they are just to look at. So this International Dark Sky Association, and I have no idea how authoritative or recognised it is, but it does award dark sky status to a couple of places, and we have one in Australia. So next time we can travel around freely between our states after COVID, I'll make sure I go there, and I'm going to inquire about why we haven't applied for more, because we have plenty of places that could, fit into that category. But you took yourself off. You say about sparking the idea of adventure in the wild side. I'm not sure if it was the wild side to go off to a man-made forest, but you did, to something called, is it Kielder Forest?
That is correct.
What's the story of that? It's a man-made forest and lake in Northumberland.
That is correct. So Kielder, funnily, a lot of my friends here in England haven't heard of Kielder, and it's a 100-year-old forest. It's about a 3-hour train journey straight north. It's right at the border of England and Scotland. And what happened was that 100 years ago, when the World War ended, there was a need for wood. And people decided we really need to grow some forests because we're going to need wood for shipbuilding, for lining our trenches and our mines. And wouldn't it be a nice idea to start a pin forest somewhere, a working forest? The Duke of Northumberland passed away and the estate came into the hands of the government. And very wisely, they began planting what they call silviculture. And they planted Sitka spruce trees that survive well in the cold, boggy area. And this massive forest of 600 square kilometers got going at that time, along with the lake, which is a reservoir that produces hydroelectricity. It is Europe's largest man-made forest and lake. And I happened to go there with my friend, and we decided, let's go see what it's all about and let's walk in it. And we did our lakeside walks and we did our forest walks, and it was absolutely magnificent.
And you went out at night?
We did. So we did our day walks, and then at night, because it was summer, we had to wait just a tiny bit. We had to wait till it was 10:30, and then we'd step out, and there it was, a sky without any artificial light, a sky that was absolutely beautiful and pristine and pure. And Kielder has another trick up its sleeve. It has an observatory. And even though I couldn't get a ticket to go to the observatory the days that I was there because it's so popular and because of COVID, they're taking fewer people, I was introduced to Dan Monk, the astronomer, who guided me. And there are places to watch the dark skies. You don't have to be in an observatory. There are high points and there are lakeside places where one can just look up. And that's what we did. We just looked up and, we enjoyed this vast sky where, it was just from one end to the other, you could see the constellations. And now we have all these brilliant apps on our phones, such as Skyview Lite. And all I had to do was hold up my phone and say, there's Venus rising, there's Jupiter. Every little star could be pinpointed by my phone. And
yes, those apps, they might make a difference to people being interested in having dark skies. I mean, they should be interested anyway. But with these apps, it might mean that because people can look with some knowledge and say, that's, whatever it is, whatever constellation, they're a bit more interested than simply being fascinated by a dark sky with some stars in it. The apps allow them to get a bit closer to understanding and to go away and read something about that constellation that's in their area. That might be just what we need.
Yes, it's very empowering as individuals to be able to just point the phone and know exactly what that star is. But there are also other apps that help people take photographs with iPhones of our celestial spheres. And that's very exciting as well, because earlier one couldn't take any pictures unless you had very serious cameras. But now we're enabled by our phones to take a wonderful...
What app do you have for taking pictures?
It's called Nightcap.
In any event, Gatika Jain, thanks for joining us on Counterpoint. You've made it very clear, I think, to our listeners, we need dark skies.
Thank you, Amanda.
That's the program for this week. Thanks for joining us. Until next week, this is Amanda Vanstone saying, see you later.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.